The human rights situation in India at the end of 2022 is growing from bad to worse. It can best be described as something abysmal, something really horrible.
We see a gradual degeneration and slipping down of the human rights standard and practice in India.
The situation of human rights in India at the end of 2022 is deeply disturbing.
The exercise of the human right of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is in peril like never before.
I have serious concerns about human rights in India, with social justice activists being harassed and intimidated, rights of religious minorities being eroded, and free speech coming under constant attack from the government and its allies.
I think these twin evils of the squashing of civil liberties and the squashing of independent media voices creates a very dangerous situation.
The situation of human rights in India is vulnerable. While judiciary has articulately addressed some of the issues such as marital rape, it lagged in some cases such as freedom of expression.
Amid media censorship, extrajudicial killings by Indian forces.
The most concerning development this year is the fact that almost all the major human rights organizations in India have their Foreign Contribution Regulation Act permit cancelled. And this has a multiplying effect to the entire civil society space.
Human rights defenders continue to be in jail, continue to be incarcerated.
And also those oppose some policies of the government are being treated as anti-national.
I'm most concerned about the Indian government's continued use of draconian anti-terror laws being weaponized to put behind bars activists.
There was this whole issue of freedom of religion and belief, where certain anti-conversion laws were framed by the state, which were absolutely draconian.
Laws on religious conversion, citizenship, and other restrictive measures fly in the face of India's inclusive secular constitution and core tenets.
It wants to distinguish citizens on the basis of their faith, give vent to intolerance, insinuate otherness, and promote disquiet and insecurity.
As the Indian government continues to target the practices of minority faiths, it creates an atmosphere where discrimination and violence can take root, including vandalized mosques, torched churches, and communal violence.
My deepest concern is the increasing and unfortunately highly successful dehumanization of Indian Muslims.
The growing footprint of Hindutva effectively sends a message to Modi's backers that it is okay to attack Muslims, whether by jailing them for attending a protest, burning down their home or business, or killing them.
The impunity and immunity granted to state agents and mobs to obliterate any dissent or freedom to think.
And we see bulldozer Raj with bulldozers mowing down Muslim homes and mosques.
This year we have seen bulldozer politics, we have seen religious divisions being created in the country.
As vibrant democracies, India and the European Union share fundamental values and common interests. Together, we believe in the rule of law and fundamental rights.
The world community looks increasingly to India's leadership in furthering the principles of the Universal Declaration and sustainable development for all.
Unfortunately, such a dialogue leads to some very bland statements.
The situation for Indian Muslims is dire. The very future of India as a democratic, secular state is at risk.
Independent investigation revealed a massive unlawful surveillance apparatus being used by the government against human rights defenders.
For example, even academics in the course of their work are being put under pressure. If their work touches on a sensitive subject, they're being forced to withdraw from speaking at conferences and seminars.
Since 2014, India has fallen from 27th to 53rd on the Democracy Index.
That is why I remain concerned about Prime Minister Modi's government's efforts to peel back the rights of religious minorities in India.
In fact, the concern about discrimination based on religious identity are so great that the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has recommended that India be designated a country of particular concern.
In recent years, I have been watching with dismay at the moves undertaken by the Indian authorities to criminalize human rights defenders, the abuse of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, and the conflation of human rights defenders' legitimate peaceful work with terrorism. Indeed, just last week, India was named once again in the UN Assistant Secretary General's report for having engaged in acts of reprisals against those who interact with United Nations human rights mechanisms.
Because of the continued massive discriminatory treatment experienced by minorities in the country, including the potential denial of citizenship and statelessness facing millions of mainly Muslim and Bengali minorities in an increasingly hostile and even violent environment of hate.
As an elected member of the Human Rights Council, India has a responsibility to shape global human rights and to protect and promote the rights of all individuals, including members of minority communities. India's voice on the global stage can only gain in authority and credibility from a strong commitment to inclusive and respect for human rights also at home. And the Indian model of plurality is based on a simple but profound understanding. Diversity is a richness that makes your country stronger.
We recommend, secondly, to enact the law on the prevention of community violence and to amend laws against minorities.
Further strengthen laws that protect religious minorities.
To take measures to prevent the abuse of so-called anti-conversion laws.
To enact a new law and take necessary measures to prevent collective and targeted religious violence in accordance with human rights.
Initiate legal and other measures to combat hate speech.
The government hold accountable public officials who advocate religious hatred.
To review the design and implementation of the National Citizens Registry to avoid statelessness.
Carefully review the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act and the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act to ensure freedom of expression, assembly and association, and the protection of civil society organizations and human rights defenders.
Properly apply the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act in compliance with international human rights standards.
Revise the Unlawful Activities Prevention Amendment Act and to assess its conformity with international law to ensure that it is not used against human rights defenders.
Immediately release all human rights defenders in detention.
There were some things in 2022 which provided us with a glimmer of hope.
In good news, I applaud the suspension of the sedition laws.
Although it is a temporary suspension,
the suspension of the absurd colonial era sedition law by the Supreme Court of India pending its review.
There was a ray of hope when sections of society, say in Goa, were able to stop a massive project.
During the last 1 year, it is very fortunate that Supreme Court has intervened and get release of some of the human rights defenders.
The government's recent release of activists on bail is a positive development, and I hope the courts follow the principle of bail, not jail, for political prisoners in 2023.
The judiciary does still, on occasion,
take an independent stance and rule against the government and order people freed on bail.
Celebrate the courageous struggles and acts of solidarity of citizens groups, including students, laborers, Adivasis, and other indigenous peoples, in the defense of equal citizenship, workers' rights, and access to public education, food sovereignty, and land rights.
So many activists within India are continuing to fight for justice and human rights despite the myriad of risks to them. My hope is that there's going to be this really flourishing of civil society despite the real concern that people have.
As always, it's young people who are willing to look beyond religious divisions and political maneuverings, and are also today being able to recognize the role that caste continues to play in creating an unequal society, and young people who are finally willing and able to use their voices to stand up to fascist forces, to stand up to divisive politics, and actually work towards an India that is safe, secure, and equitable for all.
How do I look at 2023?
Since India is a democracy, and for every democracy to function properly, right to protest is crucial. So I hope that in the coming year, citizens of India will be able to practice this right efficiently.
I hope for greater realization of the urgency to defend rights embedded in social justice and the politics of solidarity necessary for our survival as a species.
My hopes for human rights in India for 2023 are that the country rediscovers its long-standing traditions of respect, tolerance, and inclusiveness, including in Hinduism. Rediscovers also its voices of reason and acceptance, such as those of Nehru and Gandhi, and that all Indians are reminded of their better selves, as once wrote the Supreme Court, to take up again its rightful place as a leader for human rights, not only inside the country, but also internationally.
In that, soon we will complete 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
And when this was drafted, the role that India played was absolutely critical and vital.
And thanks to an Indian woman, Hansa Mehta, Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes the equality of women and men. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights.
India, as a nation, needs to get its act together. We have justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity in the preamble of the Constitution. We need to mainstream these human rights for every single citizen of India.
My biggest hope is that the robustness of the Indian Constitution will overcome all the efforts that are being made to undermine it.
In fact, the judiciary is being impacted by the current shrinking space for civil society. I think it's really harming the judiciary. However, I still think that there is some good space for them, and the hope is that that space will continue to be widened in 2023.
Let 2023 be a new year for human rights in India.